Big Shaq stands silent in a small southern town, watching two cops slam handcuffs on an elderly black woman they should recognize. They don't know she's Eloise Bennett, the woman who raised half the town, or that the towering figure in the shadows is her lifelong protector. As cameras roll and the crowd stiffens, the weight of racism assumptions and a town's buried sins surge to the surface. One man's quiet power, one woman's stolen dignity, one town's reckoning. Will Carterville face its truth or bury it before morning? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The heat sat gentle on the shoulders of Carterville, Georgia. Not the kind that scorched or burned, but the kind that clung to you like the scent of magnolia on a breeze. Sweet, quiet, persistent. The town square breathed in rhythm with the old clock tower at its center. Time didn't rush here. It meandered like the old men who played dominoes in the shade of the hardware store, like the kids licking melted ice cream off their wrists, like the breeze that carried memories down empty sidewalks. And down one of those sidewalks walked a man who used to belong here. Shaquille O'Neal, known to the world as Big Shaq, had long ago outgrown the bounds of Carterville. Fame, fortune, arenas filled with chanting fans, he'd lived that life. But this visit wasn't for photo ops or charity galas. Dressed in a simple gray hoodie, jeans and dark sunglasses that veiled his unmistakable face, he walked the streets, not as a giant of sports, but as the son of Lucille, the boy who once shot hoops in back alleys with a milk crate for a rim. He wasn't here to be seen. He was here to feel. He passed Jefferson's Bakery. The smell of warm cinnamon rolls, still strong even decades later. Mrs. Laney, now pushing 90, sat by the window like always, dozing with a newspaper on her lap. The paint on the barbershop had faded, but the laughter from inside sounded just as rich. A gospel song hummed from someone's radio. The world had changed, but this corner of Georgia still whispered in the same voice it did when he was a boy. Shaq paused near the crosswalk, at King Street. Across the road, a small figure emerged from Daisy's grocery, juggling 3 paper bags like a circus act. One sagged dangerously to the left. The woman wobbled under the weight, her knees slightly buckled, but she kept her chin high. Eloise Bennett. Shaq's chest tightened. She hadn't changed much. Her hair, now fully silver, was wrapped in a floral scarf, and her back bent a little more than it used to. But there was no mistaking that proud stride, that stubborn determination to handle life alone. She had taught 3rd grade at Carterville Elementary for 42 years. Taught Shaq how to spell responsibility and wouldn't let him go to recess until he could say it out loud, backwards, if needed. He remembered the smell of chalk dust in her classroom, the way she snapped her fingers to get attention, the warmth of her voice when she read from Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. She was more than a teacher. She was a bridge between generations, between struggle and pride. To many, she was the backbone of Carterville. Shaq started to step forward, meaning only to help, but then he paused. A patrol car idled across the street. 2 deputies leaned against it casually, sipping iced sodas, their tan uniforms stuck to their backs from the heat, and their sunglasses mirrored the town back at itself. Deputy Ron Sanders, middle-aged, lean with a clipped mustache and a sunburnt neck, narrowed his eyes at Eloise. His partner Kyle Brooks, younger and more jittery, nudged him and nodded toward her. Shaq froze. He knew that look. He'd seen it before. On television, in airports, in his own nightmares. The kind that didn't see an elderly woman trying to make it across the street. The kind that looked straight past her dignity and saw only suspicion. Eloise's bag ripped suddenly, sending apples tumbling onto the pavement. One rolled into the gutter. She bent down slowly, wincing as her knees cracked. Shaq instinctively took a step forward again, but he stopped. Something about the way Sanders adjusted his belt and straightened up made Shaq hold back. The air shifted. The slow rhythm of the afternoon skipped a beat. Deputy Brooks crossed the street casually, walking a little too fast to be casual. Sanders followed, hand resting on his belt. The grocery clerk, a teenage boy with earbuds in, stood frozen in the doorway, unsure whether to intervene or disappear. Shaq moved back a step, blending behind a newspaper stand. He felt ridiculous hiding. At 7'1", blending in anywhere was a joke, but he didn't want to be Big Shaq right now. He didn't want to overshadow what was unfolding. He wanted to see how this would play out, if Carterville had learned anything since he left. Brooks crouched beside Eloise, now struggling to gather her groceries. "Ma'am," he said, tight and formal. "What are you doing here?" Eloise looked up, confused. "Excuse me?" "We got a report," Sanders added, stepping closer. "Someone matching your description was involved in a suspicious incident. Shoplifting." Eloise blinked. "Shoplifting? Are you, boy? I've been shopping at this store since before you were born. Look at my receipt." Shaq's stomach nodded. The groceries, the receipt still fluttering in her hand. The apples bruised on the sidewalk. It was all there. But they weren't seeing it. They weren't seeing her. They were seeing something else. Something uglier. He looked at the crowd. 2 people standing by the bank. 1 woman across the street, peeking through a curtain. No one moving. A stillness had crept in, like the first rumble before a storm. Shaq's fists curled in his hoodie pocket. "Not yet," he told himself. "Not yet." Deputy Brooks motioned toward her purse. "I'm going to need to take a look inside there." Eloise stood slowly. "You're not touching my things without a reason." Refusing to cooperate, Sanders said, voice rising. "No, I'm asking you to treat me with respect. I have done nothing wrong." Shaq felt heat rise to his ears. The type that didn't come from sun. It came from watching something fragile being mishandled. From knowing where this scene too often ended. He was Shaquille O'Neal, millionaire TV personality, Hall of Famer, but in that moment he was just a son watching a woman who reminded him of his mother getting accused for existing. And the worst part, this wasn't new. Not for him, not for anyone who looked like him. He pulled out his phone slowly, not to record yet, but to send a message, a name, just one. Someone who could help. He wasn't going to rush in like a hero, but he wasn't going to let this play out alone. Not in his town, not in front of him. Not today. 2. The misjudgment that shifts the air. The clatter of falling coins rang sharp against the lazy afternoon hum, a metallic scatter across cracked pavement that turned heads without warning. Eloise Bennett's worn leather purse had slipped from her frail arm as she reached for one of the bruised apples near the gutter. Quarters, dimes, nickels spun loose, rolling beneath a nearby bench and under the patrol car idling across the street. Eloise let out a soft, exasperated sigh, the kind of sigh only years of carrying the weight of your own survival could teach you. Across the square, a man near the cafe patio pointed abruptly, his voice rising above the heat-slowed murmurs. "Hey, I think that's the lady they're looking for. Someone just ran out of Morris's shop." His tone wasn't mean-spirited, just careless. Like someone poking at a spark without thinking if it might catch flame. Deputy Ron Sanders turned his head sharply, catching the edge of the comment. His partner, Deputy Kyle Brooks, pushed off the patrol car with a snap, shoulders straightening with an energy that hadn't been there moments before. They hadn't been paying real attention, until now, until someone else gave them a reason. Shaquille O'Neal, standing halfway behind the newspaper stand, felt his stomach drop. He'd seen this play before, in 100 small towns, in 1,000 online clips. The leap from minor confusion to major accusation. The flick of a switch that turned harmless misunderstanding into something sharp, pointed, irreversible. His heart thudded heavier with each step the deputies took toward Eloise. Eloise, still on one knee, didn't notice them yet. She was busy sweeping her hand under the bench, reaching for a quarter that danced just out of reach. Her scarf slipped slightly, revealing more of her graying hairline. She looked so small in that moment, Shaq thought. Small and yet unbreakable, the way only black women who'd spent decades surviving the world's careless wounds could be. But Sanders didn't see that. Brooks didn't either. They saw the loose coins, the torn grocery bag, the muttered whispers from the cafe patio. They saw a fit to a description they only half heard on the radio earlier. Older woman, dark clothing, possible theft. That was all it took. A matching silhouette. A scattered purse, a town too quick to assume. Shaq shifted his weight slightly, fighting every instinct to step forward. His mind ran through scenarios. Their faces if they recognized him. The distraction it would cause. The way it might pull all focus away from Eloise. He wasn't here to make it about him. He had to think. He had to move carefully. Sanders cleared his throat as they approached, voice raised just enough to carry authority, but not yet confrontation. "Ma'am, can you stop right there, please?" Eloise looked up, startled, her hand still mid-reach toward the coins. "Oh, I dropped my purse, officer." Brooks stepped closer, his shadow falling over her groceries. "We need to ask you a few questions, ma'am. Were you just over at Morris's market?" Eloise furrowed her brow, genuinely confused. "Morris's? No, I was at Daisy's grocery right over there. I've got my receipt. She fumbled slightly with the crumpled slip of paper, trying to rise while balancing the half-empty bag in her purse. Shaq clenched his fists tighter, feeling the crackle of something shifting in the air, not just suspicion, but assumption, the kind of assumption that curved shoulders, narrowed eyes, shortened patience. The cafe bystanders leaned forward slightly, intrigued. The teenage grocery clerk hovered uncertainly at the door, earbuds dangling uselessly now. No one moved to help. "Ma'am," Sanders said more firmly, stepping even closer, "I need you to stay where you are until we sort this out." Shaq exhaled slowly through his nose, pulling his phone halfway out of his pocket. Not to record. Not yet. But his thumb hovered over a contact, Darnell Pierce, his old friend, now a rising local journalist who always knew how to show up when it mattered. He typed a quick, quiet text. Brooks exchanged a glance with Sanders, a silent conversation passing between them. Shaq could read it from across the street, uncertainty mixed with defensiveness. They hadn't expected this small-town beat to turn into something. They were rattled but determined to control the moment. Eloise straightened to her full height, shaking her head with a small, tired laugh. "This is ridiculous," she murmured, more to herself than anyone. "I've been shopping here longer than you boys have been alive." But they weren't hearing her. Shaq's pulse pounded in his ears, as the memory of his mother's voice came back to him. Lucille O'Neal, warning her boy about the things that could happen in places just like this. About the eyes that sometimes refused to see you, only what they feared in you. He wasn't a boy anymore. Wasn't defenseless. But watching Eloise, watching the way her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her purse, he felt that same helpless anger rise. He knew how fast a situation like this could slip out of control, even without a single shove or raised voice. Eloise held up her receipt carefully, her voice calm but edged. "You can call Daisy yourself. I paid for everything. Look, the clerk, he saw me leave." She motioned toward the teenage boy, who froze in place, wide-eyed. Sanders waved her off. "Ma'am, please stop resisting instructions." Resisting. That word hit Shaq like a slap. He stepped slightly out from the stand, just enough to watch more closely, though still far enough to stay unnoticed by the deputies. His massive frame loomed, hidden in plain sight. His heart thundered louder, but his face stayed neutral, every muscle straining against the urge to charge forward. "Not yet." Brooks's hand hovered near his radio. "We might need backup here," he muttered to Sanders. Shaq's fingers flew across his phone. He needed Darnell here. Needed a camera, a witness, something to tip the scale back towards sanity. This wasn't just about Eloise now. This was about the choices people made when they thought no one powerful was watching. Eloise's shoulders squared slightly, her chin lifting with a pride that age hadn't dulled. "I am not resisting," she said, her voice steady. "I am telling you, you are making a mistake." The cafe patio murmured quietly, a ripple of unease, threading through the still air. Shaq knew the pattern. A small crowd gathers, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. The weight of public gaze tightening the noose of pressure. A bad call away from disaster. Shaq took a deep breath, the weight of every decision pressing into his chest. He wouldn't let this slide. He wouldn't let it escalate. But the next move mattered. One wrong step, and the entire street could tip into chaos. Not because anyone wanted violence, but because fear has a way of making people do the wrong thing fast. Across the square, Eloise adjusted her scarf, looking Sanders in the eye. "If you don't believe me, call the chief," she said softly. "He knows who I am." The chief. Shaq smiled grimly to himself. She wasn't just any old woman. She was the woman who taught half this town's leaders, whose name carried weight beyond what these two young deputies understood. He tapped out one more text to Darnell. "Get here. Fast." Shaq stayed back, a giant in the shadows, heart hammering with the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't step forward. It's make sure the world is watching when it matters most. Eloise's voice trembled as she spoke, but her words were clear, every syllable shaped by years of command in the classroom, by decades of knowing how to hold her ground with grace. "Officers, I told you, call the chief. You are making a mistake." She held up the crumpled grocery receipt again, her hand shaking slightly but her chin still lifted. Shaq, watching from his shadowed place across the street, felt a knot twist hard in his stomach, his fists curling so tight his nails bit into his palms. His chest rose and fell with controlled, silent breaths, each one a desperate grip on the urge to step in, to push through the watching crowd and demand they stop. Deputy Sanders didn't want to listen. He wanted control. He wanted the moment sealed and done, his authority unquestioned. "Ma'am, put your hands behind your back. Now." Eloise's lips parted in shock. "What are you arresting me?" "We're detaining you for questioning," Sanders said curtly, already stepping forward to grab her arm. Brooks hovered at his side, his face pale, eyes flicking nervously between the old woman and the gathering small-town audience. Eloise's grocery bag slipped from her grasp, oranges rolling in slow arcs across the pavement, one splitting open in a bright burst of juice. Shaq's body tensed as if he'd taken the blow himself. "Wait," Eloise protested, voice cracking. This isn't right. Please, I'm not." The handcuffs clicked sharply behind her back, the sound slicing through the summer air. She winced, gasping as her thin wrists were yanked roughly together. The people watching flinched but didn't move forward, their murmurs growing louder now, uneasy, hesitant, unsure if they were witnessing a misunderstanding or the start of something worse. Shaq's heart thundered in his ears. He could feel his pulse racing all the way to his fingertips. A storm roared inside him, memories flashing fast. His mother Lucille warning him as a child, "Keep your head down, Shaquille. They see your size first, not your heart." He remembered nights when she sat at the kitchen table, hands clenched around the newspaper, reading story after story of black men and women mistaken, misjudged, mistreated. He remembered the way her voice shook when she prayed for his safety after games, when the cameras turned off and the arenas emptied out, and he was no longer Big Shaq, just another black man driving home. And now, here he stood, watching it happen to someone he cared about, someone who'd watched him grow from a clumsy, towering teenager into the man he was today. He wanted to shout, to push through the crowd, to rip those cuffs off her thin wrists, but he knew what that would trigger. He'd seen it play out too many times. The wrong move, the wrong word, the wrong face stepping forward, and suddenly the situation escalates, the headlines twist, the victim becomes the problem. His fame, his money, none of it could protect him from how quickly this could spiral. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay still. He wasn't just angry, he was scared. Scared of how easily the ground could crack open beneath all of them. Eloise's eyes darted to the crowd, searching for help, her voice rising. "Please, someone, tell them. You all know me." Her plea trembled in the heavy silence. Shaq saw Mrs. Laney in the bakery window, mouth pressed into a tight line. The grocery clerk still stood frozen in the doorway, earbuds dangling like limp vines. A few people whispered to each other, but no one stepped forward. Shaq's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced down. Darnell on the way. 5 minutes. 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Might be too long. Sanders guided Eloise toward the patrol car, hand firm on her elbow. "You're under detention for questioning related to a reported theft, ma'am. Cooperate and this'll go smoothly." "I am cooperating," Eloise cried, panic edging her voice now. "You're not even listening. Please, you're hurting me." Shaq felt something crack inside him. His fists unclenched and clenched again, a rhythm of control, his breath shallow, eyes narrowing on every move the deputies made. He didn't hear the crowd anymore. He didn't hear the soft shuffle of feet, the murmurs, the town's slow awakening to the injustice playing out before them. He heard only the hammering of his own heart, the storm in his chest, the weight of every time he'd been told to wait, to hold back, to be careful. He thought about his mother, Lucille O'Neal, fierce and tender, the woman who raised him with discipline and love, who made sure he understood his worth, but also the risks that came with his skin. He could see her in his mind, her face framed by the golden porch light, her hands folding his into hers, her voice low and urgent. "Promise me, Shaquille, you'll never let them bait you. Promise me you'll use your strength wisely." His jaw clenched. He stepped forward slightly, just enough to catch Sanders' eye across the street. But then he stopped himself. Not yet. He had to think, had to weigh every second, every possibility. If he moved too soon, it would be about him. If he waited too long, it might be too late for Eloise. Brooks fidgeted at the patrol car door, clearly rattled, glancing back at Sanders. "Ron, maybe we should slow down. She's just an old woman, man." Sanders shot him a sharp look. "We've got procedure to follow, Kyle. Stick to it." Shaq's chest tightened. He could feel the fractures forming, the tipping point drawing closer. His phone buzzed again, Darnell's almost here. Camera ready. He exhaled slowly, fists still trembling at his sides. This wasn't a moment to throw his weight around. This was a moment to make sure the truth got seen. That the whole world would know what Carterville's deputies did when they thought no one important was watching. Shaq turned slightly, catching sight of Darnell's car rolling up the side street. Relief mixed with the storm inside him. Not because everything was fixed, but because at least now there would be eyes on this. Eyes that couldn't be silenced. Footage that couldn't be erased. He forced himself to step back once more, shoulders heaving, watching as Eloise, trembling but unbowed, was guided into the patrol car. He saw her glance up briefly, her gaze scanning the street, passing over him without recognition. She didn't know he was there. She didn't know she had a silent giant in her corner. But Shaq knew. And he knew he wouldn't let this end here.
Not for her.
Not for any of them. Inside the patrol car, Eloise sat trembling, her thin shoulders shaking with soft hitched sobs. The harsh click of the cuffs still pinched at her wrists, metal biting into skin that had held generations of children, wiped away their tears, lifted them when the world pushed too hard. Her face pressed lightly against the window, blurred eyes watching the familiar streets she had walked for decades, slip by in fragments. Shop signs she knew by heart, faces she'd once taught, all melting into a haze. She didn't understand how it had come to this. She didn't understand how she'd gone from buying oranges at Daisy's to being locked in the back of a police car, treated like a stranger in the town where she had given her whole life. Outside, Shaq stood still, his massive frame hidden in the shadow of a telephone pole. His chest rose and fell with slow, practiced control, but inside the storm raged hotter, faster. His thumb flew over his phone screen, his contact list open to one name only. Darnell Pierce. Darnell, the one man who could flip this entire situation with a camera and a few well-placed words. Shaq didn't type out long messages. He didn't need to. One sentence was enough. Get here. Now. Bring the camera. The deputies moved briskly, not noticing the figure watching them from the shadows. Deputy Sanders spoke quickly into his shoulder mic, requesting backup, while Deputy Brooks paced nervously near the driver's side, his gaze flickering from Eloise's hunched figure in the back seat to the small group of townspeople beginning to edge closer. The cafe crowd was no longer just curious. They were uneasy, murmuring among themselves, phones slipping into hesitant hands, cameras starting to tilt upward. Shaq spotted the hesitation ripple through the street. He felt the shift, the way a small-town secret was beginning to crack open, the way whispers were crawling through the crowd, the way people were realizing this wasn't just another arrest. He stepped back slightly, blending deeper into the shadows, his massive hands trembling at his sides. He could feel Darnell's car getting closer, his instincts sharper than any GPS. Moments later, a sleek black sedan pulled to the curb at the far end of the street. Out stepped Darnell Pierce, camera bag slung over his shoulder, his face sharp with focus. Darnell wasn't local media anymore. He was regional now, known for chasing tough stories, for peeling back the polite smiles of small southern towns, and exposing the cracks underneath. He spotted Shaq instantly, his eyes flicking once, twice. Before offering the faintest nod, he understood this wasn't about Shaq. Not yet. Shaq motioned subtly, pointing toward Eloise, who now sat slumped in the back of the car, her breath fogging the window, her chest heaving softly. Darnell's eyes narrowed as he raised his camera, the lens clicking quietly into place. The twist slid in quietly, almost like the shift in wind before a storm. Eloise wasn't just anyone. She wasn't just an elderly woman swept up in a misunderstanding. She was Eloise Bennett, the retired Carterville schoolteacher, who had shaped half the minds in this town. She had taught math to the mayor, history to the police chief, reading to the city council members. She had tutored kids after school, without pay, opened her tiny home to struggling families, and fed hungry students on her own dime. She had been the heart of this place, long before any of these young deputies put on a badge. But they didn't know. Blinded by the buzz of a vague theft report, by assumptions sharpened over years, they didn't see the woman behind the scarf and grocery bags. They saw only the silhouette, only the surface, and in their rush to control the moment, they had cuffed a pillar of the community, a woman whose name should have stopped them cold. Darnell moved with quiet precision, his camera angled low, capturing every detail, the cuffs biting into aged wrists, the bruised oranges on the sidewalk, the growing crowd shifting uneasily. He knew how to tell this story, how to shape it so that it hit the airwaves with maximum weight. And Shaq, silent, still in the shadows, knew exactly what he was doing. Inside the patrol car, Eloise's mind raced, fragments of old lessons and childhood memories flashing through her. She thought of Lucille O'Neal, the tall, fierce young mother who had come to her classroom years ago, determined that her giant son would learn discipline and grace. She remembered the boy with the kind eyes who had struggled to fit inside tiny desks, who had always stayed behind after class to help stack chairs. She hadn't seen Shaquille in years, not up close. She didn't know he was here now, watching her, heart pounding as if he were 12 again, helpless and furious. Across the street, the police chief's car pulled up. Chief John Callahan stepped out, his face already drawn tight with worry. He'd heard the call over the radio. He'd seen Darnell's texts. He knew this wasn't a situation to let spiral. He pushed through the small crowd, his eyes locking first on Eloise's figure inside the car, then on Sanders and Brooks, who straightened instantly at his approach. "Who's in the car?" Callahan barked, voice sharp. "Possible suspect, Chief," Sanders said quickly, sweat glinting on his brow. "Shoplifting report. We're following protocol." Callahan cut him off with a slicing motion of his hand. "What's her name?" Brooks fumbled for the report slip. Eloise Bennett, sir." Callahan's face blanched. Shaq saw it. The instant recognition. The dawning horror as the chief's mind caught up to what his officers had done. His jaw worked silently for a moment, before he spun on Sanders, fury barely contained. "You cuffed Mrs. Bennett? Are you out of your damn mind?" The crowd stirred, whispers turning into sharp, audible gasps. Darnell's camera clicked steadily, capturing every flicker of tension, every shift in the atmosphere. Shaq exhaled softly, the tight band around his chest loosening slightly. He stayed in place, still in the shadows, watching the moment unfold. He didn't need to step forward, not yet. He needed this to play out exactly as it was, needed the town to see what had almost happened, needed the story to hit harder than any celebrity intervention ever could. Inside the patrol car, Eloise lifted her head slowly, her tear-streaked face turning toward the commotion outside. Her eyes locked on Callahan's as the chief opened the door carefully, his voice lowering into something that sounded like an apology wrapped in shock. "Mrs. Bennett, I'm so sorry. Please, let's get those cuffs off you right now." Shaq's fists finally unclenched fully, his massive shoulders sagging just a little. He could feel Darnell's camera still rolling, feel the weight of every eye in the crowd turning from curiosity to realization. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but the tide was shifting. They knew her name now, and soon they'd know his was watching too. Darnell crouched low near the lamppost, his camera steady in his hands, lens perfectly focused on the unfolding scene. The low hum of the crowd's whispers mixed with the faint, rhythmic click of the shutter, each frame a quiet punch into the heart of the town's conscience. Eloise Bennett, frail but proud, sat with her head down, wrists still cuffed despite Chief Callahan's growing panic. Sanders and Brooks shifted uneasily, the weight of eyes pressing on them in a way they weren't used to in sleepy Carterville. They were young, eager deputies, quick to enforce, slower to question, but now the story was slipping out of their hands, and they could feel it. Shaq remained in the shadows, still wearing his hoodie, still silent, still unseen by the lawmen across the street, but visible in every frame of Darnell's camera. His towering figure hovered just on the edge, a presence too large to ignore. He wasn't here to play the superstar card, to storm the center of the scene and demand attention. No, Shaq had learned over years of living in the public eye, that his power didn't only come from fame or force. It came from knowing when to use his voice, and when to let the situation reveal itself. He quietly unlocked his phone, fingers moving across the screen with deliberate speed. First, he texted the mayor, "Need you at King Street now." Eloise Bennett, "Come quietly, no press statement yet." Then another to Reverend Palmer at the local church, "Your people need to be here." Silent witness, "Bring calm." And finally a short note to his lawyer, "Monitor social feeds, possible civil rights issue brewing." Shaq wasn't about to let this slip away as just a local misunderstanding. He knew too well how fast moments like this could spiral or be buried. Darnell, meanwhile, kept circling, his camera picking up the restless energy spreading through the bystanders. A young mother whispered to her son, pulling him gently away from the street. An elderly man near the bakery crossed his arms tightly, eyes narrowing at the deputies. The grocery clerk, who had once been frozen in the doorway, now stood outside, glancing nervously at the gathering crowd. Murmurs floated up like mist. That's Mrs. Bennet, right? I thought she retired 10 years ago. Why are they treating her like this? Sanders' jaw flexed, his authority slipping as the air thickened. Brooks fidgeted, casting glances at the growing cluster of townspeople, and then at the camera lens he hadn't noticed at first, but now couldn't seem to escape. The story they thought they were controlling, one of quick action, clean resolution, was dissolving under their feet. Shaq watched it all carefully, the lines of tension deepening around his mouth, his broad shoulders braced against the pull to intervene. Every part of him wanted to cross that street, rip open the patrol car door, and take Eloise's trembling hands into his own. But he knew the script of this moment. If he stepped in too soon, too visibly, it would all become about him. It would turn into a celebrity spectacle, not a story about a woman wronged or a system exposed. He needed to let Carterville see itself, raw and unfiltered, before he added his voice to the reckoning. Chief Callahan spoke urgently to Sanders now, his face flushed, eyes darting to Darnell's camera. Get those cuffs off her, now. But sir, we're following, Sanders began, only to be cut off sharply. I don't care what you're following. She's not a suspect. She's Mrs. Bennet. Get the cuffs off. The crowd leaned in collectively, tension snapping tight like a pulled wire. Brooks reached hesitantly for the keys, fumbling slightly before unlocking the cuffs with an audible click. Eloise winced as her arms were freed, her small frame sagging slightly, not from defeat but from sheer exhaustion. She rubbed her wrists gently, the skin marked red and tender. Darnell didn't lower his camera. He didn't rush forward for an interview or a soundbite. He simply kept recording, letting the truth hang in the air, like a weight no one wanted to claim yet. His lens caught every detail, the apology in the chief's eyes, the discomfort on the deputies' faces, the whispered prayers moving through the crowd as Reverend Palmer and a small group from the church arrived quietly at the scene. Shaq's phone buzzed again. Mayor, on my way. He nodded slightly to himself. The pieces were falling into place. This wasn't going to be buried. Not this time. He allowed himself a brief glance skyward. The sun dipping slightly toward late afternoon, casting long shadows across the square. The same streets he'd once run across as a child. The same storefronts he'd ducked behind when his mom called him home for dinner. The same town that had lifted him up when he was nobody, and then cheered his name when he became somebody. Now it was showing him its cracks, its blind spots, its need to reckon with itself. He felt the weight of it settle on his chest, the responsibility, the sorrow, the quiet power he held simply by being here and choosing not to look away. Eloise, gathering her composure, looked out over the crowd. For the first time, her eyes found Shaq, her gaze softening in sudden recognition. She didn't smile, didn't wave, just held his gaze with a silent, fierce gratitude that needed no words. She knew he had been there, that he had been watching, holding the line in a way only someone with his kind of presence could. And Shaq in return gave her the slightest nod, a silent promise that this wasn't the end of the story. The tension remained, the reckoning still to come. But now the town was awake, and Shaq, steady and waiting, was ready to make sure it stayed that way. The air around King Street had thickened, pulsing with a kind of electricity that wasn't quite noise but wasn't silence either. People were still gathering, drifting in from side streets and storefronts, some drawn by curiosity, others by a gnawing sense that something was happening they couldn't look away from. The crowd now stretched across the sidewalk, a slow building wave of faces, some familiar, some strangers, all watching the same fragile, fraying scene unfold. Shaq remained near the edge, massive shoulders tense, hoodie pulled low, eyes sharp and locked in. He didn't need to step forward yet. The town was stepping forward for him, each murmured conversation, each glance exchanged between neighbors, each widening set of eyes told him the shift was coming. People were realizing it wasn't just about a woman in cuffs, it was about who that woman was, and what it meant that no one had stopped the deputies sooner. Sanders, sweating harder now, tugged at his collar, his jaw working fast. We followed protocol, he muttered under his breath, but loud enough that a few closest bystanders could hear. She fit the description, just another one of them. The words hit the square like a slap. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. Careless, sharp-edged, tossed out like a throwaway line. But the moment the phrase left his mouth, a ripple ran through the gathered crowd. People stiffened, faces hardened. A soft gasp rose near the bakery. Someone near the cafe put a hand to their mouth. It wasn't just misunderstanding anymore. It was prejudice, naked and unguarded, laid bare for everyone to see. Shaq's eyes darkened, his chest tightening as the knot of restrained anger twisted tighter. He had heard that phrase his whole life, heard it whispered on basketball courts, muttered in boardrooms, hidden in polite conversation, and now here it was, out in the open, ugly and raw. Darnell, crouched behind his camera, didn't flinch. He zoomed in, locking focus on Sanders' face, capturing the exact moment the deputy realized what he'd let slip. The video was already live now, streaming across social media, watched by hundreds, then thousands, the numbers ticking upward like a heartbeat in the corner of the screen. From his place in the shadow, Shaq's phone buzzed. Text after text poured in. Friends, activists, reporters picking up the feed. The outside world, now watching what had begun as a small-town moment. Shaq read each message with a cold, calm clarity. He wasn't surprised. He knew the story was too big, too sharp to stay local. He'd counted on that. The police backup arrived next, 2 more patrol cars pulling up fast, their doors opening in near unison. Officers stepped out briskly, hands on belts, scanning the crowd. But behind them came another car, moving slower, its lights off, its engine purring low. The mayor. Shaq's quiet summons had worked. Mayor Gerald Lawson was a broad-shouldered, middle-aged white man, with thinning gray hair, and the stiff, polite bearing of someone used to shaking hands and dodging hard questions. But today his face was pale and drawn tight, his eyes darting from Eloise in the patrol car to Sanders, to Brooks, to the restless, whispering crowd. Shaq stayed where he was, watching carefully, feeling the moment coil tighter. The police chief, John Callahan, was right behind the mayor, his own face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. He moved fast, cutting through the backup officers, and striding directly to the patrol car where Eloise still sat, her shoulders hunched, her head bowed. He yanked the door open sharply. "Mrs. Bennett, please," he said, his voice a mix of apology and urgency. "Let me help you out." Eloise looked up slowly, her eyes tired but fierce. She stepped out with slow, careful movements, her wrists still sore from the cuffs. The crowd exhaled softly, a collective breath they hadn't realized they were holding. And then came the murmurs, sharp, rising, undeniable. "She's the one who taught me in 2nd grade. That's Eloise Bennett. She ran the church food drive for years. Why didn't they recognize her? Why did they treat her like that?" The camera lens tightened on faces, capturing the emotional turn, the guilt, the confusion, the realization sweeping through the onlookers. People weren't just bystanders anymore. They were witnesses. Sanders stepped back, pale and rattled, shooting a panicked glance at Brooks, who looked like he wanted to melt into the pavement. The mayor spoke quietly to Callahan, his hands gesturing tightly, his expression grim. This wasn't a local scuffle anymore. It was a public scandal, unfolding live, with Shaquille O'Neal's name quietly humming just beneath the surface. Shaq's fists relaxed slightly, but his eyes stayed locked in, his breath slow, controlled. He knew better than to think this was over. Darnell straightened slowly, camera still rolling, panning across the deputies' faces, the backup officers, the mayor, the chief. He swept the lens across the crowd, capturing the tension, the heartbreak, the slow, painful awakening of a town forced to see what it had ignored for too long. Eloise stood straighter now, her scarf slipping slightly off her hair. She glanced across the street, her eyes briefly locking with Shaq's. She didn't wave. She didn't need to. That look was enough. A fierce, quiet connection, a reminder that they both knew what this was about. The mayor stepped forward, raising a hand slightly, his voice trying to steady the waves. "Folks, please, let's all stay calm. We're going to address this properly." But the crowd wasn't moving. No one was going home yet. Shaq checked his phone again. More messages pouring in. National reporters now picking up the live feed. Civil rights groups asking for statements. He felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. He had started this quietly, in the shadows, but it was growing now. Bigger than him, bigger than Carterville. And he was ready. Ready to step forward, not as Big Shaq the celebrity, but as Shaquille, the son of Lucille, the boy who knew what it meant to carry the weight of 1,000 silent injustices. The crowd shifted again, the mood turning, not just anger, but resolve. People weren't just murmuring anymore. They were recording, calling friends, raising their voices. Shaq watched, his heart steady, his eyes fierce. The tide had turned, and there was no stopping it now. Chief John Callahan's voice sliced through the chaos like a crack of thunder. Get those cuffs off her. What the hell were you thinking? His face, usually calm and measured, was flushed with fury as he stormed across the street. His badge glinted under the setting sun. His fists clenched so tight his knuckles blanched. His deputies, Sanders and Brooks, stumbled over their words, trying to explain, but Callahan wasn't listening. Not yet. His eyes were locked on Eloise, his old teacher, his childhood mentor, standing in the street with red-marked wrists and a face that carried generations of dignity. The crowd had thickened, pressing in closer, their whispers rising like a steady drumbeat. People who'd known Eloise for decades, people who owed her their grades, their discipline, their very futures, now watched in stunned silence. Darnell's camera kept rolling, weaving in and out faces, the tight lines of guilt, the widening eyes of realization, the open mouths gasping, as the weight of the mistake settled across the square. And then, without warning, Shaq moved. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward from the shadows where he'd kept himself hidden. His 7'1" frame cut across the line of sight, his shoulders broad, his head held high, hoodie falling back slightly to reveal his face. The crowd's gasp was instant, sharp, collective. It wasn't just the shock of celebrity, though that rippled through them too. It was the shock of recognition. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just a famous face from TV or basketball highlights. He was a son of Carterville. He was Lucille's boy. He was the kid Eloise had tutored after school, the teenager who could barely fit in classroom chairs, the young man who'd left town with a dream and come back a giant. Eloise's eyes widened, softening with something between relief and fierce love. Shaquille, she breathed, her voice cracking under the strain. Shaq took a step closer, lifting his sunglasses slowly and tucking them into his pocket. His face was calm, not stone cold, not furious, but heartbreakingly painfully calm, the kind of calm that only came when rage had been swallowed whole and replaced with something heavier. "Mrs. Bennett," Shaq said softly, his deep voice carrying easily across the tense silence. "I'm here." Callahan froze, his mouth half open, realizing just how badly his department had miscalculated the stakes. The mayor, standing stiffly beside him, paled visibly. Darnell's camera swung sharply, capturing the moment Shaq's full presence hit the crowd like a silent wave. Shaq turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the officers, the chief, the murmuring crowd. His voice, when he spoke again, was low. Not a shout, not a demand, but a quiet, measured weight that pulled every eye, every ear toward him. "She's family," Shaq said, his voice thick but controlled. "Eloise and my mom raised us side by side. She helped me with homework when I was failing English. She fed me when my mom worked 2 jobs. She taught me how to stand tall before I ever played a single game." He paused, the silence pressing in tighter. "And you didn't even know who you had in those cuffs." The deputies shifted uncomfortably, their faces pale under the weight of Shaq's words. Sanders opened his mouth to speak but found no words. Brooks stared at the ground. Shaq exhaled slowly, his massive hands flexing slightly at his sides. "This isn't about whether you made a mistake," he continued softly. "It's about what you saw when you looked at her. You didn't see a teacher, or a neighbor, or a mother figure. You didn't even see a person. You saw a problem to handle, a threat to shut down." The crowd stirred, the tension shifting from shock to anger. Not the explosive kind, but the simmering, bone-deep kind that doesn't fade with a single apology. Shaq turned slightly, catching Darnell's camera in the corner of his eye, knowing the world was watching now. "My mom, Lucille," Shaq said, his voice breaking just slightly. "She used to tell me, 'Baby, you're gonna grow up bigger than everyone else, and they're gonna judge you for it before they know you.' She taught me how to carry that weight, how to walk through life careful, measured, always careful. But no matter how careful you are, no matter how much you give back, no matter how much you achieve," his eyes glistened faintly, "you still watch the people you love get crushed under the same old assumption." Eloise, standing nearby, let out a shaky breath. Her eyes met Shaq's, and for a moment, the crowd, the cameras, the town all melted away. It was just the two of them, the boy she'd helped raise, the woman who'd held him steady, bound now by something no headlines could capture. The mayor cleared his throat, stepping forward as if to regain control of the moment. But Shaq raised a quiet hand, stopping him without a word. "I'm not here to cause a scene," Shaq said, turning his gaze back to the crowd. "I'm here to make sure we don't forget what this felt like. The weight of it. The cost of it. Not just for Eloise, but for every person who walks these streets, wondering if they're one wrong glance away from losing their dignity. Chief Callahan swallowed hard, his eyes flicking nervously between his officers and the crowd. He took a slow step toward Shaq. Shaquille, we made a mistake here. Shaq nodded slightly, his face still heartbreakingly soft. I know, John. But fixing a mistake isn't just about saying sorry, it's about asking why it happened, and making sure it doesn't happen again. The crowd murmured in agreement, a slow ripple of resolve building. Neighbors turned to each other, whispering fiercely, some shaking their heads, others wiping at their eyes. The town had been jolted awake, and Shaq's voice was the bell that refused to let it fall back asleep. Shaq turned one last time to Eloise, his voice softening. We've got you, Mrs. Bennett. You're not alone. And with that, the giant who had once been a quiet son, a boy taught by the very woman now at the heart of this reckoning, stepped fully into the light, not as Big Shaq the celebrity, but as Shaquille, the man, the witness, the weight-bearer who refused to look away. The evening light softened, washing the square in a golden haze that stretched long shadows across the brick streets. The crowd had stilled, yet an invisible current thrummed between every person there, a tension not of immediate anger but of reckoning, of seeing something that could no longer be unseen. Eloise Bennett, still trembling slightly, stood tall now, her wrists freed, her scarf straightened by the gentle hands of a nearby neighbor. Shaq towered beside her, not imposing himself as the center, but steady as a protective wall, his presence undeniable but not loud. Chief John Callahan cleared his throat, stepping forward with measured care. His voice carried across the hush, layered with public responsibility and private shame. Mrs. Bennett, he began, his hands spread slightly, palms forward, I cannot tell you how sorry we are. This should not have happened. Eloise raised her chin, her voice steady despite the faint shake in her arms. No, John, it shouldn't have, and it didn't have to. The crowd murmured softly, the truth of her words rippling outward. Shaq, standing tall, didn't posture or raise his voice. Instead, he turned slowly, fixing his dark, steady gaze on Deputies Sanders and Brooks. I'm not here to call for your jobs, he said quietly, each word carefully measured. I'm not here to drag you through the mud on national television. That's not what this is about. Sanders shifted uneasily, his mouth tightening as if preparing for a blow that never came. Brooks avoided eye contact altogether, staring at the ground, his chest rising and falling too fast, his youth suddenly raw and exposed. Shaq took a slow step closer, his deep voice lowering just slightly, pulling them in. I want you to look at her, he said, nodding toward Eloise. I want you to look her in the eye, not as a suspect, not as a profile, but as a woman, as a human being who's given her life to this town, who shaped generations here. Sanders hesitated, but Eloise met his gaze first, lifting her chin with a quiet strength that filled the square more powerfully than any shout. Her eyes, still glistening but sharp, held his. Brooks followed slowly, his throat working visibly as he forced himself to meet the old woman's gaze. She taught half of Carterville, Shaq continued, his voice soft but cutting, including the chief, the mayor, probably your own parents. She's not a stranger. She's not a description. She's not one of them. She's us. And you almost crushed her under the weight of your own assumptions. Callahan swallowed hard, turning back to the deputies. His voice was tight, official but laced with something deeper. Deputies Sanders and Brooks, as of now you are suspended pending formal review. His jaw tightened as he looked at the crowd. We will conduct a full investigation, with transparency, and we will make sure this town learns from today. The murmurs deepened, not of protest, but of grim, measured approval. But Shaq wasn't finished. He turned slightly, addressing the town, not from a podium, not from behind microphones, but simply as one of their own. His voice carried, not by volume, but by gravity. This isn't just about these two men, he said quietly. This isn't just about Mrs. Bennett. This is about Carterville, about every quiet moment when someone looked the other way, or said it was none of their business, or decided it was easier to believe the worst about someone because of the way they looked. A hush fell across the square as his words sank in, settling like dust on the shoulders of the people who had gathered. Darnell's camera panned across the faces, the baker who'd known Eloise for decades, the grocery clerk who'd hesitated at the doorway, the young mothers who'd pulled their children closer when the deputies arrived, the older men who'd stood by without intervening. Faces tightened. Throats worked. And then softly, like the first crack of dawn, someone in the crowd spoke. I remember when Mrs. Bennett brought us food after my dad lost his job, an older woman murmured, her voice trembling. I was failing math, and she stayed after school with me every day until I passed. Someone else added, she saved our neighborhood from shutting down the community center. Another voice said, firmer now. The crowd shifted, voices rising in waves, not shouting but sharing, quiet stories, small confessions, memories unspooling into the open air. For years the town had carried these moments tucked away, taken for granted. Now, under the sharp light of reckoning, they were being pulled forward, held up, made visible. Shaq's chest rose slowly as he let the town speak. He wasn't here to lecture them. He was here to hold them, to hold the mirror up, to let them face themselves. The mayor, his face pale and drawn, stepped closer to Shaq, his voice tight. Shaquille, we will make an official statement. We'll set up town forums, trainings, whatever's needed. Shaq nodded once, his expression grave. Good. But don't make it about press releases. Make it about people. Eloise reached out gently, placing her weathered hand on Shaq's massive arm. You did good, baby. She whispered softly, her voice just loud enough for him to hear. You stayed calm. You made them see. Shaq's eyes glistened faintly, his throat tightening. I learned from the best, he murmured back. The camera kept rolling, but for a moment, it wasn't about the footage, the news cycle, or the public fallout. It was about a town realizing that its cracks had been visible all along, that it had walked past its own better angels too many times. The square pulsed with quiet energy, a hum of something beginning, not finished, not fixed, but begun. And at the center Shaq stood steady, not as a hero who had saved the day, but as a man who had forced his hometown to face itself, and who now bore the responsibility of making sure it didn't turn away again. The night had settled deep over Carterville by the time Shaq pulled into his mother's driveway. The old house sat quiet and familiar, its white porch railing gleaming softly under the porch light. Crickets hummed in the grass, their steady chorus a reminder that even after the day's storm, the world kept moving. Shaq sat in the car for a long moment, his massive hands resting on the steering wheel, his mind still tangled in the echoes of the square, the crowd, the tension, Eloise's trembling hands, the heavy silence after the deputies had been pulled back. Finally, with a slow, measured breath, he stepped out, the gravel crunching under his feet. The screen door creaked as he opened it, and there she was, Lucille O'Neal, his mother sitting on the porch swing like she had so many nights before. She rocked gently, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes sharp and waiting. She didn't rise. She didn't rush him. She simply watched, her gaze full of the kind of knowing that only mothers carry. Shaq settled onto the porch step, his tall frame folding down carefully, his elbows resting on his knees. For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the soft creak of the swing, the buzz of the night, and the slow exhale of two people carrying generations of weight. Lucille broke the silence first, her voice low, tinged with both pride and reprimand. I heard about today, baby. Shaq let out a long breath, rubbing a hand over his face. Yeah, I saw Darnell's footage, Lucille continued, her tone tightening. Saw you standing there in the shadows watching it all play out. You waited too long, Shaquille. Shaq turned slightly, his face lined with exhaustion. Mama, I couldn't just jump in. You know how it works. If I'd stepped up too soon, it would have turned into a show. Into a headline about me. I needed them to see her, to see what they were doing, not just who was watching. Lucille's eyes softened, but she didn't let go entirely. I understand that, son. I do. But watching can cut just as deep. You carry that weight whether you act or not. Shaq's shoulders sagged, his head bowing slightly. I know, Mama. For a while they sat like that, mother and son, bound by an unspoken understanding, by years of warnings and lessons, by the raw ache of knowing how thin the line is between dignity and danger. Lucille reached out, her weathered hand resting gently on Shaq's broad shoulder. You've always been big, baby, she murmured softly. Bigger than your classmates, bigger than the other boys on the court, bigger than most grown men by the time you were 16. And you've always had to carry that carefully. But there's a difference between carrying yourself carefully and carrying the world's weight on your own back. Shaq let her words settle, his chest tightening. Mama, sometimes it feels like no matter what I do, it's never enough. I can donate money. I can build community centers. I can speak at schools. I can show up quietly in my hometown. But it's still there. That look. That suspicion. That moment when they see the color before they see the man. Lucille's gaze softened further, her eyes glistening faintly. Baby, that's not your fault. And it's not your burden to fix alone. Shaq leaned back slightly, staring up at the stars, peeking through the dark. It's just, I had to hold it together today, Mama. I couldn't break. I couldn't yell. I couldn't be the angry black man towering over the police. I had to stand there, let them walk their own path to realization, let them feel the weight of what they were doing. And you know what? That was harder than anything I've ever done on a court. Lucille smiled faintly, her fingers squeezing his shoulder gently. That's the kind of strength I raised you to have, Shaquille. Not the kind that comes from muscles or fame. The kind that knows when to fight loud and when to fight quiet. But don't think for a second that you didn't fight today. But Shaq closed his eyes briefly, letting the quiet wash over him. I keep wondering, Mama, is it ever going to be different? Is there ever going to be a day when we don't have to walk this line so carefully? When I don't have to choose between stepping up or standing back? When people just see us for who we are, not what they're afraid we might be? Lucille's voice was soft, steady, lined with the wisdom of 1,000 hard-won lessons. That day's coming, baby. Maybe not in our lifetime, but every time you stand firm, every time you hold a mirror up to the world, every time you help someone see, you push that day a little closer. Shaq's eyes glistened faintly, his throat tightening as he reached up, covering his mother's hand with his own massive palm. I wish you didn't have to worry about me like this, Mama. Even now. Lucille chuckled softly, a warm, rich sound that wrapped around them like a blanket. Shaquille, I'll always worry. That's my job. But you. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto his. You're doing yours. You're using the gifts God gave you. Not just for yourself, but for your people, for your town, for your elders. That's what matters. The porch creaked gently under their weight, the swing rocking slowly again. Across the yard, the cicadas sang, the night breeze carrying the scent of honeysuckle. Shaq exhaled slowly, the knots in his chest easing just slightly, the weight he carried shared, if only for a moment, by the woman who had taught him how to carry it in the first. For tonight there were no cameras, no crowds, no hashtags, no press statements. There was just a son and his mother, sitting under the stars, holding space for the pain and the hope that came with every step forward. And in that quiet, in that stillness, Shaq understood that sometimes, the greatest act of strength wasn't in towering over injustice or shouting it down. Sometimes it was in holding your people close, carrying their stories, and promising quietly, fiercely, that you would keep standing, keep fighting, keep watching, until the day came when they didn't have to anymore. By the next morning, Carterville was no longer just a sleepy southern town. The footage Darnell had captured had rippled out, crossing from local news segments to national headlines. Clips ran on morning shows, hashtags spun across social media, and commentators debated what it all meant. It wasn't just about a retired teacher wrongly cuffed on a dusty street. It was about the thin line between assumptions and consequences, between overlooked moments and national reckoning. Shaq sat in the back room of a modest community center, the weight of the past 24 hours pressing heavy on his chest. His phone vibrated non-stop, calls from journalists, requests for interviews, messages from fellow athletes, civil rights leaders, and old friends offering solidarity or asking how they could help. He glanced over at Darnell, who sat cross-legged on the floor, laptop open, phone in one hand, coordinating interview requests, while still plugging clips. Across the room, Mayor Lawson paced nervously, preparing for the public statement they'd agreed to make together. Shaq took a deep breath. He knew what he had to do, not just as a public figure, but as a son of Carterville, as a man who had witnessed too much, who had carried the weight of being both invisible and hyper-visible, depending on how the world chose to look at him. When they stepped outside, the square was already filling. Not a massive crowd, but enough. A gathered hum of townspeople, reporters, camera crews, neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder. Eloise Bennett sat calmly near the front, her hands folded in her lap, flanked by familiar faces, former students, church members, old friends. The mural had already begun taking shape on the brick wall of the corner store. Bright underpainting showed Eloise's silhouette, not alone but surrounded by dozens of small faces, children of every color, the next generation looking outward. Shaq stepped up to the makeshift podium, the mayor beside him, the police chief standing just behind. He adjusted the microphone, his deep voice rolling across the square with quiet power. I want to start by saying this. I'm proud to be from Carterville. Shaq began, his eyes sweeping the crowd. This town raised me. Mrs. Bennett raised me. My mama raised me. And today, I'm standing here not to tear Carterville down, but to help it rise. He paused, letting the words settle. I'm not here to condemn every officer in this town. I know most of you, and I know your hearts, but I am here to call for something real. Accountability, training, reflection, heart. His gaze sharpened, the weight of his words landing with precision. It's not enough to have good intentions. It's not enough to say, we didn't know. We have to know. We have to listen. We have to look at the people in front of us, not at their clothes, their skin, their wallets, but at their humanity. The crowd stirred. The murmurs not of protest but of thoughtful agreement. Shaq's voice softened slightly, the emotion thickening. I could have stepped forward yesterday. I could have pulled rank, used my name, my fame, made it all stop in an instant. But if I had, the town wouldn't have seen itself, wouldn't have faced what it needed to face. And Miss Bennett, Shaq's eyes flicked toward her, his throat tightening, deserved more than just a personal rescue. She deserved a community rescue. She deserved all of you standing here today, seeing her, hearing her story, carrying it forward. Mayor Lawson shifted beside him, nodding grimly. Chief Callahan's eyes were downcast but focused, his shoulders stiff with the effort of absorbing hard truths. Shaq's final words rang clear. This isn't over. It's not fixed by a press conference, or a suspension, or a mural. It's fixed when every town in America understands the cost of prejudice, the price we all pay when we let assumptions shape our actions. And I promise you this, I won't stop fighting for that. Not here, not anywhere. As the crowd erupted in a soft wave of applause, not loud, not raucous, but heartfelt, Shaq stepped back, exhaling slowly. The mayor moved forward to speak, and Darnell's camera kept rolling, but Shaq knew his part here was done. For now, that evening, long after the crowds had dispersed, Shaq walked back alone to the spot on the street, where Eloise had been arrested. The sun had set, the street lamps casting golden circles onto the pavement. In his hands he held a small bouquet of flowers, not expensive, not fancy, just simple white lilies, their petals trembling slightly in the breeze. He crouched down slowly, his massive frame folding with care, and laid the flowers gently on the exact patch of sidewalk where the grocery bag had spilled, where the cuffs had clicked shut, where the town's eyes had finally opened. For a moment he stayed there, his hand resting lightly on the pavement, his head bowed, not for the cameras, not for the crowd, for himself, for Eloise, for Lucille, for every name he carried silently, every story that had shaped him, every unseen weight he'd balanced across his shoulders. As he rose, he glanced up toward the mural, now nearly complete. It wasn't a painting of him, of Big Shaq, the basketball star, the icon. It was Eloise, her arms outstretched, surrounded by the faces of children she had taught, guided, protected. It was her story that would live on these bricks, her legacy that would remind Carterville of the moment it nearly failed one of its own. Shaq's phone buzzed softly in his pocket, but he ignored it. He turned slowly, the cool night air wrapping around him, and walked back toward his mother's house. Lucille was waiting on the porch, as she always was, her silhouette framed by the light. As he reached her, she stood, her arms folding him into a fierce, wordless hug. And as they stood there beneath the stars, Shaq made a silent promise, not just to her, not just to Eloise, but to himself. He would keep walking forward. He would keep carrying the weight, not until the world was perfect, but until every small town like Carterville understood the true cost of turning away. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it stop here. Carry its weight into your own streets, your own circles. Ask yourself, who am I overlooking? What quiet injustices am I stepping around? Start the conversations that make people uncomfortable, the ones that crack open real change. Remember, it's not about waiting for heroes. It's about deciding you won't look away.